Dedicating our entire program to three of the most respected and best loved professionals, not just here at the ABC, but right across the Australian media. Journalist Paul Lockier, cameraman John Bean and pilot Gary Ticehurst were killed last night in a helicopter accident in remote South Australia. They were filming some news and current affairs features about Lockyer. Police are still investigating exactly what went wrong, but we may not know for some time. It's almost impossible to believe that the trio who'd so enthusiastically planned and anticipated another outback assignment are lost to us. It's also very difficult to do justice to the length and breadth of their wonderful work, but we will try. My colleague Tracy Bowden has assembled this tribute.
This surely must be the best way to see Australia going along at low level in a helicopter. This is the Sydney ABC helicopter circa 1988, meticulously maintained with the most professional of all helicopter pilots in Australia. And for the last decade, this chopper's been used to cover the drought in eastern Australia. And you get really dramatic vision from up here, seeing the drought move across the countryside. It's much more than a mode of transport, therefore. It's also a filming platform and an office. So we use these phones, the ordinary phone and the satellite phone, to arrange our stories and to move around the countryside. If it's dramatic to see this country in drought, it's much more dramatic to see it when the seasons turn, as they have now, to see it lush and green, especially around Lockyer. And at this height, you can pick up everything across the floodplains. So you see the dingoes down there, the emus and the kangaroos and the birds lifting as you go across the lakes. It's sensational. This, in a way, is the armchair of the nation.
This was a team which travelled to some of the most remote and remarkable parts of the nation. The reporter, the helicopter pilot, the cameraman. Through their combined skills, they captured striking and heartbreaking images of Australia and the mood of the people. Droughts, floods, natural wonders.
You have to keep reminding yourself that this is a desert, usually a barren, forbidding place. It's remarkable enough when the occasional flood event turns the arid centre into shades of green. Extraordinary when it happens 2 years in a row.
Environmental scientist Richard Kingsford travelled with the three men and was struck by the close bond between them.
I had the real privilege of flying with them in the helicopter and watching the way they told the story, and it was almost as though they were all in sync. You know, John would be filming, Paul would be saying, what about that angle? But Gary was already there, looking at the monitors on front of his control panel. And I just marvelled at the way that they would be able to identify where the light was coming and be able to position the helicopter along a river system or up over a sand dune.
After starting as a cadet at the ABC, Paul Lockier worked around the globe and across Australia and was still passionate about his craft after more than 40 years. His overseas postings covered most of the world, from the United States to Asia.
The Khmer Rouge claims that it has changed its ways of being...
And the Conservatives see Texas as virtually a frontline state against the communist menace in Central America.
Vietnam holds hopes that 1984 can finally produce signs of economic recovery. But it's much more...
Former TV colleague and friend Ray Martin has known Paul Lockier for more than 30 years.
I used to say to me, you know, he had Peter Pan pill, he just got younger. Well, we got older, Lockiers kept getting younger. And you'd look at, he looked like he was 45 when he was 61.
Do you want some help with that?
Yeah, no, well, it is hard.
That youthful exuberance came through as Paul told the stories of the vast country west of the Dividing Range.
And I used to tell him he had the best job in the world. I love those bush stories, and he'd ring me up from wherever he was saying, guess where I am, and you'd love to be here, that sort of stuff. But he wasn't just a bush reporter, of course. He covered the Olympic Games, and he got a Logie for ABC coverage of the Olympic Games. He used to do, a flower show for midday, where he'd go out and talk to a couple of old ladies on something for midday.
Ray Martin says Paul Lockier's character was the strength behind his journalism.
One of the great tests of journalism, I think, is, can you go back the next day and talk to somebody, especially if you've done something that might be critical? And he could be as tough as the next bloke in terms of doing stories. He just did it with a velvet glove. But he could always go back the next day. And that's the great test, that if you got your facts right and you've told the story accurately, even if someone doesn't like the story, they still talk to you. And they always talk to Lockers.
Paul, in a sense, thought like an artist, despite being a documenter. He had a poetic and lyrical sense of what the landscape was about.
With his passion for Lake Eyre, Paul Lockier found a kindred spirit in artist John Olsen.
Wow.
Just last week, Paul opened an exhibition of John Olsen's series on Lake Eyre. The artist drew on Paul's work for his own.
When John was doing these works, when he was in the studio, he referred to Paul's DVDs to be able to capture certain colorations, etc. But also, Paul's narrative was wonderful and also captured John's imagination as well for this exhibition.
Paul Lockier called the ABC helicopter his ute. At the controls was chopper pilot Gary Ticehurst. He started his flying career in the Australian Army in 1973.
And recognise that sort of the flexibility offered by the helicopter.
I'd like Gary to be remembered not just as a great bloke, but from a cinematographer's point of view, probably one of the greatest camera operators ever. I first met Gary on the Big Country episode called Pudding Pan Hill. The Pudding Pan Hill expedition was something that was led by Les Hiddens, and Gary at the time was a helicopter pilot with the Army.
Gary Ticehurst's work on this Big Country shoot led to him joining the ABC in 1980. A gregarious, much trusted figure, he transported reporters and crews far and wide.
Sienna, this is the ABC chopper. I'm just talking to Marine Search and Rescue at the moment. I possibly would endanger your yacht to make any assistance attempt at this stage, over.
He showed the extent of his skills during the tragic Sydney to Hobart yacht race of 1998, as he flew in treacherous conditions to locate and assist stranded yachtsmen.
Stand aside.
I don't think Gary ever thought about Gary Ticehurst particularly. Gary did the job that had to be done.
Winston Churchill, ABC chopper. Go ahead with your position, over.
No, for a fact that he was there coordinating a lot of the rescue because he was communicating, and in one of the instances, I know that he stood by over one of the boats, waiting for the rescue helicopter to get there. He wasn't going to abandon them and leave them.
With cameraman John Bean on board, the result was always going to be remarkable. His colleagues describe him as a craftsman. The pictures he shot at Lake Eyre are magic.
Well, to describe John Bean as a cameraman is an understatement. He was a very good writer. He was a technical whiz. He was a producer. He could come up with journalistic angles on a story. When I first worked with him, I was a bit taken aback because you would explain the story to him and he would come up with a few lines of investigation, perhaps questions you could ask as well. And I was a bit shocked at first, and then thinking, oh, that's good, I'm glad I thought of that idea. But never in an abrupt way. His manner was amazing. He had fantastic people skills, which is incredible when you think that camera work is an antisocial activity. You're putting yourself behind the camera there, you're in the eyepiece, you're detached from the rest of the world. Yet John could somehow transgress that. He had a rapport with the people he was filming. but he could still be a master at this antisocial art, and I think that's why his work was so fantastic.
Quite simply, John Bean loved his job.
Technically, he was fantastic. I worked with him up in the Torres Strait, a completely different shoot, where you had time, where you had beautiful pictures. His work ethic was amazing. I remember working with him in the Darling Downs. We had a picture that was a story that was a little picture poor. And unfortunately for cameramen, some of the best pictures are at dawn. But he would volunteer. He would say, "No, I'll get up early tomorrow. Don't you worry, because this will look a lot better as the sun is rising."
There's no other media organisation that does this the way the ABC does it, and the way Paul Lockier did it, and the way Gary Ticehurst and John were able to portray those images, find those images, and tell the stories, many, many stories across our landscape. And, you know, that's the great legacy.
The team had headed back to Lockyer for what was to be the third and final instalment of the Lockyer series.
They always talked to Lockers, which is why, you know, he and Gary and John would be able to go back to these various stations, and they'd arrive in the chopper and they'd bring a slab of beer, and they'd suddenly find that there was there was meat for them. They'd sleep out in the shearers' quarters or whatever, and on they'd go. But people were happy to see them, and because they told the truth, they told it accurately, and they were good blokes.
Good blokes, true professionals, greatly loved.